Margaret Holloway stood in the lawyer's office, staring at a deed to a property she didn't know her husband owned. 43 years of marriage, and Gerald had never once mentioned the farm. But that wasn't the strangest part. When she arrived at the overgrown homestead 3 days later, she found a black stallion in the barn, wild, magnificent, and according to the locals, impossible to approach. The horse had been there for decades. No one could touch him, no one could ride him, and no one could explain why Gerald had kept him hidden all those years. Before I tell you what Margaret discovered about that stallion and why her husband kept that farm a secret his entire life, I need to ask you something. Have you ever learned something about someone you loved after they were gone? Something that completely changed how you understood them? Maybe it was a hidden talent, a past they never shared, or a promise they'd been keeping in silence. If you have, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, stories about the secrets we keep and the legacies we leave, they're what we're all about. Now let me take you back to where this all began, to a widow who thought she knew everything about her husband, and a farm that held answers she never knew to look for. Margaret had buried Gerald on a Tuesday. It was a small funeral, just the way he would have wanted it. A few neighbors from their street in Asheville, their daughter Cassandra, who flew in from Denver, and Father Brennan, who'd known them both for 20 years. The service was simple, dignified, respectful. Gerald had been a quiet man, an accountant who kept perfect books and never missed a day of work in 40 years. He'd been reliable, steady, predictable in the best possible way. Or so Margaret had thought. The following Friday, she sat across from Arnold Whitaker, Gerald's attorney, in an office that smelled of old leather and lemon polish. Arnold had been Gerald's college roommate before he'd gone into law. He was one of the few people Gerald had kept in touch with over the decades, though Margaret had always found their friendship puzzling. Arnold was gregarious and loud where Gerald had been reserved and soft-spoken. "There are a few items to go over," Arnold said, adjusting his reading glasses. "The house is in both your names, as you know. The retirement accounts, the savings, all straightforward." He paused, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "But there's one asset that Gerald kept solely in his name, a property in Willow Creek." Margaret blinked. "Willow Creek? Where is that?" "About 90 miles west of here. Mountain country. He purchased it in 1982, the year after you were married." Her hands felt cold. "Purchased what exactly?" "A farm, 63 acres with a house, barn and outbuildings. He's been paying the property taxes on it every year." Arnold's expression was careful, neutral. "You didn't know about it?" Margaret shook her head slowly. 43 years. They'd shared a bed, raised a daughter, weathered her mother's death and his father's stroke. They'd made every major decision together. Or she'd thought they had. "What was he doing with a farm?" "I don't know," Arnold admitted. "He never discussed it with me beyond the legal paperwork. But it's yours now, Margaret. Fully paid off, no liens. The deed transfers to you automatically." She took the folder home and didn't open it for 2 days. When she finally did, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, she found photographs inside. Not recent ones. These were old, printed on that thick paper they'd used in the 80s. The colors slightly faded. They showed a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn that needed painting, fields rolling away toward tree-covered mountains. And in one photograph, standing beside the barn, was Gerald. He looked young, 30 maybe. His hair still dark, his face unlined. He was smiling in a way Margaret hadn't seen in years. Really smiling, like something had lit him up from the inside. She'd never seen that photograph before. Cassandra called that evening. "Mom, are you okay? You sound distracted." Margaret told her about the farm. There was a long silence on the line. "Dad owned a farm? Since when?" "Since before you were born, apparently." "Did he ever go there? I mean, did he just buy it and forget about it?" "I don't know." Margaret looked at the photograph again, at Gerald's unexplained smile. "I think I need to see it. Want me to come with you?" "No, sweetheart, you've got work. I'll be fine. It's just a drive." But it wasn't just a drive, and Margaret knew it. It was a journey into a part of Gerald's life she'd never known existed, and she wasn't sure what she'd find when she got there. The GPS took her off the highway and onto increasingly narrow roads that wound through pine forests and past rushing creeks. Willow Creek itself was barely a town: a general store, a post office, a diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside. Margaret stopped at the general store for directions, and the woman behind the counter, who had to be pushing 80 herself, peered at the address on the deed. "Oh, the Holloway place," she said immediately. "Straight through town, left at the old mill, about 4 miles up Ridgeline Road. Can't miss it. White house, red barn." "You knew it was the Holloway place just from the address?" The woman's smile was knowing. "Honey, everybody knows that property. Has quite a history, that place does." Margaret wanted to ask what kind of history, but something in the woman's tone made her hesitate. Instead, she thanked her and drove on. The farm appeared exactly as it had in the photographs, except older. The white paint on the house had gone grey in places, and the porch sagged slightly on one side. The barn's red had faded to rust brown, and the fields had gone wild with goldenrod and blackberry brambles. But the bones were good. You could see that. The structure was sound. Margaret parked her sedan beside the house and sat for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel. This was Gerald's secret. This place he'd owned for over 40 years and never mentioned. She felt an odd mix of emotions: hurt that he'd hidden it, curiosity about why, and something else she couldn't quite name. A sense that she was on the verge of understanding something important about the man she'd loved. She got out of the car. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, with the scent of pine and something sweet she couldn't identify. Wind moved through the tall grass, making it whisper and sway. The front door was locked, but the key from Arnold's folder fit perfectly. Inside, the house was dusty but intact. The furniture was simple, rustic: a sofa with faded plaid upholstery, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a stone fireplace. It looked like someone had walked out intending to return, except that had been decades ago. Margaret moved through the rooms slowly. The kitchen still had dishes in the cupboards. The bedroom had sheets on the mattress, though they smelled of age and disuse. In the closet, she found men's clothes: work shirts, denim jeans, boots. Gerald's size, but not clothes she recognized. These were farm clothes, work clothes, different from the pressed slacks and button-downs he'd worn to his accounting office. Who had Gerald been here? What version of himself had he inhabited in this place? She was standing in the bedroom, holding one of the work shirts, when she heard it, a sound from outside. A whinny, high and sharp, cutting through the afternoon quiet. Margaret went to the window. From here she could see the barn, its doors slightly ajar, moving in the breeze. Another whinny, unmistakable now. A horse. She went outside and crossed the overgrown yard to the barn. The doors creaked when she pulled them wider, and sunlight spilled into the dusty interior. She smelled hay, old wood, leather, and beneath it all, the warm, familiar scent of horse. And there, in the largest stall at the back, was the Stallion. He was black, completely black, without a single white marking. His coat caught the slanted light like polished obsidian, and his eyes watched Margaret with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He was powerful, beautifully built, with a proud arch to his neck and a presence that filled the barn. Margaret stopped several feet from the stall. She'd grown up around horses. Her father had kept 2 mares when she was a child, and she knew enough to read the signs. This was not a gentle farm horse. This animal was wild, barely contained, radiating a kind of coiled energy that suggested he could explode into motion at any moment. "Hey there," she said softly. "Easy, boy." The Stallion tossed his head, his mane flying. He didn't approach the stall door, didn't seem aggressive, but he made it clear he was not interested in human contact. There was water in his trough, fresh water, and she could see the remains of hay in the corner. Someone had been feeding him recently. Margaret heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a man standing in the barn doorway. He was somewhere in his 60s, weathered and lean, wearing work clothes that had seen better days. "You must be Mrs. Holloway," he said. Figured you'd come around eventually. Who are you? Name's Luther Barnes. I live down the road about 2 miles. Been looking after things here since your husband passed. Someone from the lawyer's office called me, said you might be coming. Looking after things, Margaret repeated, glancing back at the stallion. You mean the horse? That's right. Been taking care of Thunder since Gerald couldn't anymore. Thunder? Luther nodded toward the stallion. That's what Gerald called him. Been here long as I can remember, long as Gerald owned this place anyway. Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't understand. Gerald never mentioned... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. He never told me any of this existed. Luther's expression was sympathetic. Figured that might be the case. Gerald was a private man. Did you know him well? Well enough. Not friends exactly, but friendly. He'd come up here every few months, stay for a weekend, sometimes a week. Always alone. He'd work on the property, tend to Thunder, then head back to wherever he came from. Luther paused. Didn't know he'd passed until the lawyer called. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Margaret looked at the stallion again. Can you tell me about Thunder? Where did he come from? Luther's face clouded. That's a story Gerald should have told himself. All I know is the horse has been here since the beginning, and in all these years I've never seen anyone ride him. Gerald tried once, early on. Thunder threw him so hard he was laid up for a week. After that, Gerald just took care of him, fed him, groomed him from outside the stall, talked to him, but he never tried to ride him again. A horse no one could touch, Margaret murmured. Why keep him? That, Luther said quietly, is the question, isn't it? Margaret spent that first night at the farm, sleeping fitfully in the bedroom that still smelled of dust and secrets. She woke before dawn to the sound of Thunder moving in his stall, his hooves striking the barn floor with restless energy. She made coffee in the kitchen. The utilities were still connected, paid automatically from some account Gerald had maintained, and sat on the sagging porch as the sun rose over the mountains. The beauty of the place was undeniable, and she found herself understanding why someone might want to own this land. But why hide it? Why keep it secret from her, from Cassandra, from everyone in their normal life? Luther arrived around 9, his truck rattling up the driveway. Thought you might want some help going through things, he offered. If you're planning to stay a while, that is. I don't know what I'm planning, Margaret admitted. But yes, I could use the help. They started in the barn. Besides Thunder's stall, there was tack hanging on the walls, saddles, bridles, all well maintained despite their age. There was a small office of sorts in one corner with a desk and filing cabinet. Margaret opened the filing cabinet and found years' worth of records. Veterinary bills for Thunder, receipts for feed and supplies, maintenance logs for the property, all meticulously documented in Gerald's precise handwriting. The accountant in him had kept perfect books even here, but there was more. In the bottom drawer, she found a leather-bound journal. She pulled it out carefully, her heart beating faster. The leather was worn soft with age, the pages yellowed. She opened it to the first entry, dated March 15th, 1982, signed the papers today. The farm is mine, ours, though she doesn't know it yet. I'll tell her when the time is right, when I figure out how to explain it all. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. It was Gerald's handwriting, definitely, but the voice was different from any letter or note he'd written to her. This was raw, unfiltered, emotional in a way Gerald rarely allowed himself to be. April 3rd, 1982. Thunder arrived today. He's everything Samuel promised. Magnificent, wild, completely untamable. He kicked down half his stall within an hour. But when I look at him, I see what Samuel saw. Freedom, power. Everything I gave up when I chose the safe path. Margaret's breath caught. Samuel. Who was Samuel? She flipped ahead, scanning entries. April 18th, 1982. Tried to approach Thunder with a saddle. He went berserk. Luther said I was lucky not to get killed. Maybe he's right. Maybe some things aren't meant to be tamed. Maybe some parts of who we are should stay wild, even if we can't live them out. May 2nd, 1982. Margaret suspects something. She asked why I was gone all weekend. I told her I was at a conference. The lies are getting easier, which scares me more than the truth would. Margaret closed the journal her vision blurring with tears. Luther had moved to the other side of the barn, giving her privacy, but she could feel his presence, his quiet understanding. She wiped her eyes and kept reading. June 15th, 1982. Cassandra was born today. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect. Margaret was incredible, so brave. When I held our daughter, I felt the weight of every choice I've made. I can't be that person anymore, the one who dreamed of living differently. I have responsibilities now, a family, but I can't let go of this place, of Thunder. They're the only connection I have left to who I might have been. The journal spanned decades, though the entries grew less frequent as the years passed. Gerald wrote about his work, his frustrations with the mundane details of accounting, his love for Margaret and Cassandra, his quiet desperation at the life he'd chosen, and always, always, he wrote about Thunder. July 4th, 1995. Thunder is getting older, but he hasn't slowed down. Still wild, still free. I envy him that. I've been thinking about Samuel again, about the summer before I met Margaret, when everything seemed possible. Margaret flipped to the back of the journal, to the final entry, dated just 3 months before Gerald's death. October 8th. The doctors say it's cancer, stage 4. They're giving me 6 months, maybe less. I need to make arrangements for Thunder, for the farm. I want to tell Margaret everything, but how do I explain 40 years of silence? How do I tell her that I kept this part of myself hidden, not because I didn't love her, but because I loved her too much to burden her with my regrets? Some secrets aren't meant to protect, they're meant to preserve. I wanted her to know the man I chose to be, not the one I left behind. Margaret closed the journal and sat with it in her lap, tears running freely now. Luther approached quietly, handed her a handkerchief without a word. "Did you know," she asked, "about any of this?" "I knew Gerald came here to escape something," Luther said gently. "Figured it was either his past or his present. Maybe both. He wrote about someone named Samuel. Do you know who that was?" Luther hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Samuel Garrett. He owned this farm before Gerald. Died in 1982. Left it to Gerald in his will. That's all I know." Margaret looked up sharply. "Someone left Gerald this farm? He didn't buy it?" "That's what I heard from the old-timers. Samuel and Gerald knew each other somehow from before Gerald moved to Asheville. When Samuel passed, the farm went to Gerald, and Thunder with it." 1,000 questions crowded Margaret's mind, but one pushed to the front. "Where can I learn more about Samuel Garrett?" Luther considered this. "There's a woman in town, Lorraine Murphy, runs the library such as it is, 2 rooms above the post office. She's lived here her whole life, knows everyone's history. If anyone can tell you about Samuel, it's her." Lorraine Murphy was 73 years old, sharp as a tack, and delighted to have a research project. When Margaret explained what she was looking for, Lorraine's eyes lit up behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Samuel Garrett," she said, her voice warm with memory. "Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Come with me." She led Margaret to a back room filled with filing cabinets and boxes. "We're not exactly the Library of Congress, but we've got local records going back over a century. Birth certificates, death certificates, newspaper clippings, property records." She pulled out a box labeled 1945, 1985. Samuel was quite a character. "Let's see what we have." Over the next 2 hours, Margaret pieced together the story. Samuel Garrett had been born in Willow Creek in 1931, the son of a farmer who'd owned the land for generations. He'd grown up working the fields, riding horses, living the life of a country boy in the mountains. But Samuel had been different, artistic, sensitive, drawn to beauty in a way that set him apart from his rougher peers. In 1949, at 18, he'd left for college in Asheville. He'd studied literature and art, shocking his family who'd expected him to return and take over the farm. But Samuel had other plans. He'd fallen in love with the city, with culture, with possibilities his small town couldn't offer. And he'd fallen in love with a young man named Gerald Holloway. Margaret's hands stilled on the newspaper clipping she'd been reading. The photograph showed two young men at a college art exhibition, standing close together, smiling. The caption identified them as Samuel Garrett and Gerald Holloway, both students in the literature program. "This was 1950, Lorraine said quietly. "Different times, different rules about who you could be and who you could love." Margaret stared at the photograph. Gerald looked so young, so different from the man she'd known. But she recognized his eyes, the set of his shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lorraine pulled out more clippings, documents, piecing together the story. Gerald and Samuel had been inseparable through college. They'd shared an apartment off campus, scandalizing some of the more conservative neighbors. But in 1953, just before graduation, Samuel's father had a stroke. Samuel returned to Willow Creek to manage the farm, planning to go back to the city once his father recovered. But his father never recovered. He died 6 months later, leaving Samuel tied to the land, to responsibilities he'd tried to escape. Gerald visited for a while. The records showed that property tax documents with both their names on correspondence, receipts from the general store for supplies purchased together. But by 1955, Gerald's name disappeared from the local records. "He went back to Asheville," Lorraine explained. "Samuel stayed here, ran the farm alone, never married, lived quietly. The locals knew he was different, but this was a small town. People mostly let him be." Margaret found herself asking the question that mattered most. Did Samuel resent Gerald for leaving? Lorraine handed her one final document, a copy of Samuel's will, dated January 1982. "I leave my farm and all its contents, including the Stallion Thunder, to Gerald Holloway, in recognition of the life we might have lived together and the choices we each had to make. May he find peace here that he couldn't find with me." Margaret read it 3 times, her throat tight with emotion. "Gerald came back when Samuel was dying," Lorraine said softly. "I remember because it was the talk of the town. This man showing up after all those years, staying with Samuel through his final weeks. Samuel passed in February '82, and Gerald inherited the farm a month later. Then he left again, but I guess he never really let go of the place." Margaret sat in silence, the pieces falling into place. Gerald had loved Samuel. He'd left him to pursue a conventional life, a career, a wife, a family, but he'd carried that loss with him for 40 years, manifested in a secret farm and an untamable horse. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a symbol of everything wild and free that Gerald had given up. "Did my husband—" She had to stop, clear her throat. "Did he make the wrong choice, leaving Samuel?" Lorraine's smile was gentle, sad. "I don't think it's that simple, dear. He loved you too, didn't he? He built a life with you, raised a daughter. Those aren't wrong choices. They're just different ones. Sometimes we love more than one person, more than one version of who we could be. The tragedy isn't in choosing. It's in never being able to choose all of it." Margaret stayed at the farm for a week, then 2. Cassandra called daily, worried, but Margaret assured her she was fine. She needed time to process, to understand, to grieve not just for the husband she'd lost, but for the parts of him she'd never known. She read Gerald's journal cover to cover, absorbing every entry, every confession, every moment of longing he'd captured on those pages. She learned about his struggles with identity, with duty, with desire. She learned about long weekends at the farm, where he'd work himself to exhaustion trying to outrun his thoughts. She learned about the nights he'd sit in Thunder's stall, talking to the horse for hours, confessing things he could never say out loud anywhere else. "Thunder understands," he'd written once. "He knows what it means to be caged by gentleness, to be trapped in a life that's comfortable but wrong. Neither of us can break free, but at least we can rage against it together." Luther continued to help with the property, showing Margaret how to maintain things, how to feed Thunder safely from outside the stall, how to check the fences and maintain the barn. He was patient, kind, never prying into what she'd learned, though she suspected he knew more than he let on. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence together, Luther said, "You planning to keep the place?" Margaret drove a nail into the wood, considering. "I don't know." Part of me wants to sell it to close this chapter, but another part feels like that would be betraying something. Gerald kept this place alive for 40 years. There must have been a reason beyond just memory. Maybe he was keeping a door open, Luther suggested. A place where he could be all of himself, even if just for a few days at a time. We all need that, I think. A place where we don't have to choose. That night, Margaret sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over the mountains. She thought about her marriage, about the man she'd loved, about all the things they'd shared and all the things they'd kept private. She'd been hurt, yes. Hurt that Gerald had hidden this from her, but she was also beginning to understand. Gerald hadn't hidden the farm to deceive her. He'd hidden it to preserve the life they'd built together, to protect her from the complexity of his past, from the questions that had no easy answers. He'd compartmentalized his grief, his longing, his unfulfilled desires into this place so they wouldn't bleed into the life they shared. It was an act of love in its way. Misguided, perhaps, but love nonetheless. She went inside and called Cassandra. "Mom, are you okay? You sound different." "I'm all right, sweetheart. Better than I've been in a while, actually. Listen, I need to tell you something about your father, about this farm, and why he owned it." She told Cassandra everything, about Samuel, about Gerald's past, about the choices he'd made and the secrets he'd kept. She expected shock, maybe anger, but instead heard only quiet understanding. "Did he love us?" Cassandra asked finally. "Despite everything?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "He loved us completely. That was never in question." "Then the rest," Cassandra paused, "the rest is just part of who he was. We don't have to understand all of it to accept it, do we?" "No, I suppose we don't." They talked for another hour, working through feelings, asking questions neither could fully answer. When they hung up, Margaret felt lighter, as though she'd set down a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. The next morning, she went to the barn with a new purpose. Thunder watched her approach, his dark eyes wary as always. She stopped at his stall door, close enough to see the grey starting to show around his muzzle, the signs of age creeping into his powerful frame. "Gerald loved you," she told the stallion softly. "Maybe because you reminded him of himself, wild and free in a way he couldn't be. Maybe because loving you was simpler than loving the rest of us. I don't know." Thunder tossed his head but didn't back away. "I'm not going to try to tame you," Margaret continued. "I'm not going to try to ride you or change you or make you into something you're not. Gerald understood that some things should stay wild. I'm starting to understand it too." She stayed there for a long time, talking to the horse about Gerald, about Samuel, about love and choice, and all the complicated ways humans navigate their hearts. And maybe it was her imagination. But Thunder seemed to settle as she spoke, his restlessness easing, his breathing deepening. When she finally left the barn, she felt she'd made a kind of peace, not just with Thunder, but with everything the horse represented. 3 weeks after her arrival in Willow Creek, Margaret received a call from Luther. His voice was tight with worry. "You need to come to the barn. Something's wrong with Thunder." She ran across the property, her heart pounding. Inside the barn, she found Luther standing outside Thunder's stall, his face grave. The stallion was down, lying on his side, his breathing labored and shallow. "I found him like this an hour ago," Luther said. "Called the vet. She's on her way, but Margaret, he's old. This might be it." Margaret entered the stall, something she'd never dared before. Thunder didn't try to rise, didn't show any of his usual wariness. She knelt beside him, placed her hand on his neck. His coat was damp with sweat, his muscles trembling. "Easy, boy," she whispered. "Easy." The vet, Dr. Rebecca Chen, arrived 20 minutes later. She examined Thunder with gentle efficiency, then sat back on her heels, her expression somber. "His heart's giving out," she said quietly. "It's common in horses his age, especially ones who've lived with high stress levels. I can make him comfortable, but you can't save him," Margaret finished. "I'm sorry." Margaret looked down at Thunder, at this magnificent animal who'd carried Gerald's secrets for so many years. "Do whatever you can to ease his pain. I'll stay with him." Dr. Chen administered medication, checked Thunder's vitals, then left them alone. Luther offered to stay, but Margaret shook her head. "This is something I need to do myself." She sat beside Thunder as the afternoon light slanted through the barn windows, as the shadows lengthened and deepened. She talked to him about Gerald, about the journal entries, about the love that had brought both of them to this place. She told him about Samuel, about the young man Gerald had been, about the life they'd almost lived. "He never forgot," she said, stroking Thunder's neck. "He came here every few months just to see you, to remember, to touch that part of himself he'd locked away. You kept him honest in a way. You kept him connected to who he really was." Thunder's breathing was growing shallower. His eyes, when they met hers, seemed almost grateful. "I'm not angry anymore," Margaret whispered. "I understand now. Love isn't simple. It's not just one thing or one person. Gerald loved me, loved Cassandra, and loved Samuel too. All of those loves were real. All of them mattered. And you," she leaned closer, her voice breaking, "you were the keeper of the love he couldn't live out. That's a sacred thing." The sun was setting when Thunder took his last breath. It was quiet, peaceful, like falling asleep. Margaret sat with him for a long time afterward, her hand on his still warm shoulder, letting herself cry, for the horse, for Gerald, for Samuel, for all the complicated beauty and pain of loving imperfectly in an imperfect world. When she finally emerged from the barn, Luther was waiting on the porch. He didn't ask any questions, just pulled her into a brief, gruff hug. "I'll help with the burial," he said. "There's a spot up on the hill where Samuel used to watch the sunset. Seems fitting." They buried Thunder the next morning, in a grave overlooking the valley, with the mountains rising purple and gold in the distance. Margaret placed a stone at the head of the grave, simple and unmarked, like the lives of the men who'd loved him. Standing there, looking out over the land, Margaret felt the final piece click into place. This farm wasn't just Gerald's secret. It was his sanctuary, the place where all the different parts of him could coexist without judgment, without explanation, without having to choose. In the weeks following Thunder's death, Margaret made her decision about the farm. She called Cassandra, discussed options, considered possibilities. In the end, she knew what felt right. She hired contractors to repair the house, to update the plumbing and electrical, to restore the barn. She had Luther help her clear the fields, plant new gardens, make the place livable year-round. And then she moved in. "You're staying?" Cassandra asked when Margaret told her, surprise clear in her voice. "For a while at least. Maybe longer. I spent 43 years being Gerald's wife in Asheville. I think I'd like to spend some time understanding the part of him that lived here. And what about your life, your friends? This is my life now," Margaret said gently. "At least for now, I'm not running away from anything. I'm running toward understanding." She made friends in Willow Creek. Lorraine became a regular companion for coffee and conversation. Luther continued to help around the property and gradually became something more than just a helpful neighbor. She learned the rhythms of rural life, the quiet pleasures of tending land, of watching seasons change, of living close to nature. She converted Thunder's stall into a reading room, lined with bookshelves holding Gerald's books, the ones from the farmhouse and boxes of literature and poetry she had shipped from their home in Asheville. It felt right, transforming the space where Gerald had confessed his secrets into a place of contemplation and beauty. She found a box of letters in the attic, correspondence between Gerald and Samuel from their college years. Reading them was like watching two young men fall in love on paper, their words careful at first, then bolder, full of dreams and promises. She cried reading them, but they were not bitter tears. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of grieving for the tender, frightened boys who'd had to navigate a world that didn't allow them to love openly. One letter in particular stayed with her. Samuel had written it in 1954 during one of Gerald's visits to the farm. "I know you have to go back. I know you have a life there, responsibilities, expectations. And I know that what we have, what we are, isn't something the world will let us keep. But I want you to know that these moments with you are enough. They have to be enough. When you leave, take part of me with you. And when you need to remember who you really are, come back. The door will always be open." Margaret framed that letter and hung it in her reading room, a testament to love that persisted despite impossible circumstances. A year after Thunder's death, Margaret hosted Cassandra for a long weekend at the farm. Her daughter had been curious about the place, wanted to see where her father had kept his secrets, wanted to understand the man he'd been. They walked the property together, Margaret showing her the repairs she'd made, the gardens she'd planted. They visited Thunder's grave, and Cassandra stood there silently for a long time. "Do you think he was happy?" she asked finally. "Dad, I mean. Living two lives like that?" Margaret considered this. "I think he was as happy as he knew how to be. He made choices that allowed him to have a family, a career, stability, but he also made sure to preserve the part of himself that didn't fit into that conventional life. Was it ideal? No, but it was his solution to an impossible problem." They sat on the porch that evening, drinking wine and watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Cassandra told her mother about her own struggles, a relationship that had ended because she'd felt trapped, a job she was considering leaving, questions about who she was and who she wanted to be. "I think I understand Dad better now," she said quietly. "How hard it is to choose between different versions of yourself, different possible futures. How sometimes you end up trying to live all of them at once. The difference," Margaret said, "is that you have more freedom to be honest about it. You don't have to hide parts of yourself the way he did. Times have changed." "Some things have changed," Cassandra agreed, "but the basic problem is the same, isn't it? We're still trying to figure out how to be true to all the different parts of ourselves without breaking into pieces." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "Your father found a way, imperfect as it was. He kept this place alive for 40 years. He took care of Thunder. He never stopped honoring that part of himself, even if he couldn't live it openly. That's not nothing. Are you happy here, Mom? Really happy?" Margaret looked out over the darkening land, at the barn where Thunder had lived and died, at the mountains rising against the star-filled sky. "Yes," she said, "I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm living a life that's entirely mine. Not defined by being someone's wife or mother, though I loved those roles, but something more. Something that's just for me." Before Cassandra left, she and Margaret planted a tree near Thunder's grave, a young oak that would grow strong and tall, providing shade and shelter for generations to come. They didn't speak as they worked, but the silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. As Cassandra's car disappeared down the driveway, Margaret stood on the porch, feeling a profound sense of peace. She'd come to this farm expecting answers to simple questions. Why had Gerald hidden this place? What had he been doing here? Who had he been when she wasn't around? Instead, she'd found something more valuable, a deeper understanding of the complexity of love, the courage it takes to honor all parts of ourselves, and the grace required to forgive the people we love for being imperfectly human. She went inside and sat in her reading room, surrounded by Gerald's books, by the letters he and Samuel had exchanged, by the journal that had revealed his innermost thoughts. She picked up the journal and opened it to a random page, reading his words from 30 years ago. "Some days, I think I should tell Margaret everything, about Samuel, about this place, about the part of me that never quite fit into the life I chose. But then I imagine the hurt in her eyes, the questions I couldn't adequately answer, and I lose my courage. Maybe that makes me a coward, or maybe it makes me human. I don't know anymore. All I know is that I love her. I love our daughter, and I also love the memory of what I had with Samuel. Those loves don't cancel each other out. They coexist, uneasily but truthfully, in the landscape of my heart." Margaret closed the journal and held it against her chest. "I understand now," she whispered. "I forgive you, and I'm grateful for the life we built, for the honesty you found here, for trusting me enough to leave this place in my hands." Outside, wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth and coming rain. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The farm settled around her, solid and real, a testament to love in all its complicated forms. Sometimes the greatest gifts we receive are the ones that come with questions attached. Gerald left Margaret a farm, a secret history, and a legacy of choices both made and unmade. He left her thunder, wild and untamable to the end. But most importantly, he left her the opportunity to understand that the people we love are never just one thing, never just the roles they play in our lives. They are complicated, contradictory, full of longings they may never fulfill, and dreams they may never speak aloud. And loving them means accepting all of it. The parts they show us, and the parts they keep hidden, the lives they live with us, and the lives they live in secret. Margaret kept the farm. She tends it still, walking the same land Gerald walked, sitting in the same barn where he confessed his heart to a horse who couldn't judge him. She's made it her own, but she's also preserved its essence, a place where truth lives, where secrets are honored, where love in all its forms is recognized as sacred. And sometimes, in the evening light, when the shadows fall just right across Thunder's grave, she could swear she sees them. Gerald and Samuel, young and free, riding across the fields they once walked together, finally able to live the life they'd been denied. It's probably just her imagination, a trick of light and longing. But she likes to think it's real. She likes to think that somewhere, somehow, they found their way back to each other. Because in the end, isn't that what we all want? To be fully known, fully loved, fully ourselves? Gerald did the best he could with the world he was given. He loved as honestly as he knew how. And he left behind a legacy not of perfection, but of authenticity. A farm that still stands, a story that still resonates, and a reminder that the human heart is large enough to hold more love than we sometimes dare to admit. That's worth preserving. That's worth honoring. That's worth remembering. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your own life and the secrets they might carry, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories that explore the beautiful complexity of being human. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.